Ethan Cole had always believed that land was not just property, it was history. His family's ranch had stood in that part of the county for over 80 years. A sprawling expanse of rolling fields, dense woods, and weather-worn fences that marked the lines his grandfather had first surveyed by horseback in a different era. Now, the ranch was Ethan's responsibility, and though the world around him had changed dramatically, the land remained. It was a constant in a world of shifting alliances and false promises. He respected that. The gate, in particular, held a certain symbolism for him. Forged in iron, adorned with the Cole family crest, and flanked by thick stone columns, it marked the beginning of the private road that wound through the eastern side of his land. For decades, this gate had served as a quiet but firm statement. Beyond this point lay private property. For years, there had been an unspoken agreement with the community that had slowly grown just beyond the ranch's eastern boundary. A development called Cedar Springs, a neat subdivision of carefully marketed homes with manicured lawns and an active neighborhood association, had been built about 10 years ago on land sold by a distant cousin of Ethan's. The developers had seen an opportunity, and with the county's blessing, they had built quickly, attracting young families and retirees alike. The trouble was that Cedar Springs had no true public access to the main county road. The development had been designed around the assumption that the existing private ranch road, Ethan's Road, would serve as their access route. Initially, no one had asked permission. They simply began using it. Ethan, pragmatic by nature, let it go. He had no interest in making enemies of the new residents, and besides, he wasn't the kind of man to nitpick about things that didn't affect his day-to-day life. But as the years passed, the traffic increased. What had once been the occasional neighbor's car became a steady stream of minivans, delivery trucks, and contractor vehicles. Ethan noticed the change, and though it irritated him at times, he still did nothing to formalize the situation. He wasn't naive. He knew that giving explicit permission could muddy the legal waters later, but he also wasn't eager to ignite a community-wide feud. Let sleeping dogs lie, his father had always said, and so Ethan maintained his fences, tended to the livestock, and focused on running the ranch as he always had. The gate remained closed at night and open during the day, operated manually when needed. There was no keypad, no automation, just an old-fashioned chain and lock. Then, one crisp spring morning, everything changed. Ethan had risen early, as usual, before the sun, to check on a new foal born overnight. The air was cool and sharp with the scent of dew-damp earth. He saddled his horse and rode the perimeter of the ranch as he always did. It wasn't until he circled back toward the east gate that he noticed something was off. From a distance, the iron bars of the gate looked strangely altered. As he drew closer, a knot formed in his stomach. The familiar chain and lock were gone. In their place, someone had installed a sleek black electronic lockbox. Wires ran discreetly along the inside of the gate, leading to a newly mounted metal control panel on one of the stone columns. Above the panel, bolted directly onto the gate, was a polished aluminum sign that read, "Community Access Gate, open 24/7 for residents of Cedar Springs." Ethan reined in his horse, staring at the sign as a cold fury rose in his chest. No one had asked him. No one had informed him. They had simply done it. He dismounted and inspected the setup more closely. The electronic lock was high-grade, the kind used by commercial security firms. Whoever had installed it had known what they were doing. There was no paperwork, no permit posted, no indication of who had authorized this blatant invasion of his property rights. But Ethan had a good idea of where to start looking. Without wasting time, he pulled out his phone and called his attorney, Mark Ellison, a seasoned real estate lawyer who had handled the Cole family's legal affairs for years. Mark answered groggily, but Ethan's tone quickly roused him to full attention. Within an hour, Mark was at the ranch, clipboard in hand, examining the unauthorized installation. "This is bad," Mark muttered after a thorough inspection. Real bad. They're trying to establish public access through your private land. If you don't shut this down immediately, you could lose control of this road permanently." Ethan nodded grimly. He understood. If the road was used openly long enough, and if the community could claim it as a public easement, the legal battle to reclaim it would be long and uncertain. They spent the next 2 hours documenting everything. Photographs of the gate, the lock, the control panel, the sign, and tire tracks from the morning's traffic. Mark advised Ethan not to touch the equipment yet. Instead, they would send a formal cease and desist letter first and demand that the unauthorized hardware be removed voluntarily. "It's about process," Mark explained. "You want to demonstrate that you followed every proper legal channel before taking matters into your own hands." Later that afternoon, as word spread through the legal grapevine, Ethan received an unexpected visitor. Victoria Hale, the new president of the Cedar Springs Neighborhood Association, arrived at the ranch in a silver SUV. Dressed in a sharp navy suit and carrying a leather briefcase, she projected an air of confident authority. Ethan met her at the gate, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. Victoria wasted no time. "Mr. Cole," she began smoothly, "I'm here to inform you that the residents of Cedar Springs have exercised their right to establish necessary access through this roadway. You'll find the documentation in this packet." She handed him a thick manila envelope. "Given the long-standing use of this road by the community, we believe it qualifies as a public easement under state law." Ethan took the envelope but didn't open it. "Without my permission, on my land?" he asked, voice low and steady. Victoria's smile was practiced. "With respect, Mr. Cole, the law recognizes de facto easements where continuous, unchallenged use has occurred. Our legal counsel believes we have a strong case." Mark, who had arrived moments earlier, stepped forward. "That's yet to be determined, Ms. Hale. In the meantime, you're in violation of private property rights. This installation was done without consent or legal authority." Victoria's smile tightened. "We're prepared to defend our position, of course, but I do suggest that further escalation won't serve anyone's interests." Ethan said nothing more. He watched her drive away, then looked again at the sign on the gate. This wasn't going to be a simple dispute. It was a calculated move, executed with precision and backed by legal muscle. But Ethan wasn't about to back down. He would fight, not with outbursts or reckless action, but with careful, methodical steps. His family's land was at stake, and he intended to protect it. That night, after conferring further with Mark, Ethan took the first step. He hired a private security firm to monitor the gate and surrounding road, with orders to document all activity and prevent any further tampering. Simultaneously, Mark filed the cease and desist order and began preparing for the inevitable legal battle. Ethan also instructed his ranch foreman to discreetly start preparing materials to fortify the eastern perimeter if necessary. Not a wall, not yet, but the beginnings of a plan. As the sun set over the rolling fields, casting long shadows across the land, Ethan stood by the gate and watched the traffic from Cedar Springs. Cars came and went, heedless of the brewing storm. He knew it would get worse before it got better. But he also knew this: they had underestimated him. This wasn't just about a road, it was about ownership, legacy, and respect for boundaries. And Ethan Cole had no intention of surrendering what was his. The following days unfolded with an unsettling undercurrent, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Ethan was no stranger to conflict. Disputes over water rights, livestock trespass, and boundary disagreements were part and parcel of ranch life. But this was different. This was calculated, systemic, and wrapped in the thin veneer of legality. Victoria Hale had not returned since their terse exchange at the gate, but her absence was no comfort. In fact, it signaled something worse: a coordinated effort moving in the background, gathering momentum. Ethan knew enough about such fights to understand that the first strike was rarely the last. He also knew that silence from the opposition often meant the gears of bureaucracy were turning in their favor. Mark worked quickly. By midweek, the cease and desist letter had been formally served to both Victoria and the legal counsel representing the Cedar Springs Association. It cited state property laws, detailed the private ownership of the road and gate, and demanded the immediate removal of all unauthorized installations. The letter was met with a cool, calculated response. A return letter arrived via courier the next day, authored by a high-profile regional law firm with a reputation for aggressive land use litigation. The letter politely declined to remove the equipment, reiterated their claim of prescriptive easement through historical use, and warned that any unilateral action on Ethan's part to disable the gate would be met with immediate legal action. The tone was clear. They were prepared for a fight. Mark called Ethan that evening. "They've been planning this for a while," he said grimly. "This isn't some half-baked HOA stunt. The developers likely saw this coming years ago. They're gambling that you won't want to bankroll a long court fight. We need to be ready." Ethan was ready. He had no illusions about the cost, financial or otherwise. His family's land was not just worth protecting. It demanded protection. The next day, he hired a second law firm, one specializing in land use and title defense, to act as co-counsel. He also engaged a private title research firm to comb through the historical records of the ranch and adjacent parcels. If there was so much as a single document that could undermine the opposition's easement claim, they would find it. While the legal teams mobilized, a more immediate problem began to take shape on the ground. Early one morning, Ethan awoke to a call from his foreman, Jake. "Boss," Jake said, voice taut with concern, "you better get down to the East Road. Something's going on." Ethan was in his truck within minutes, driving the rutted path that led to the gate. What he found there made his blood boil. A work crew, 3 men in reflective vests with no clear markings, had arrived with a small excavator and a flatbed loaded with construction materials. They were in the process of digging a shallow trench along the inside edge of the road near the gate. When Ethan demanded to know who had authorized the work, one of the men handed him a folded document. It was a public works notice of utility easement survey, bearing the county's seal. Mark arrived shortly after Ethan's call and examined the notice. "This is a shell," he said after a quick review. "It references an easement that doesn't exist. They're trying to fabricate a pretext for infrastructure access, probably to lay conduit or fiber, something that would further establish the road as public utility space." Ethan's patience snapped. He ordered the crew to stop immediately, and when they hesitated, he called the sheriff's office. The deputies arrived in force, but their response was disappointingly neutral. The lead deputy, a seasoned man named Colton Briggs, shook his head after reviewing the documents. "I can't order them off without a court order," he said. "This is a civil dispute, not a criminal one. You'll need to take it up with the county." Ethan knew the game. The other side was leveraging the slow gears of legal process, pushing actions faster than the courts could respond. By the time an injunction could be filed and heard, the work might be done, and undoing it would become exponentially harder. That afternoon, Mark filed an emergency motion for a temporary restraining order, but the hearing was set for 3 days later, 3 days in which anything could happen. Meanwhile, the crew pulled back, but not without leaving equipment staged nearby, ready to resume work at a moment's notice. Then came the second blow. The county zoning office issued a notice of inquiry to Ethan, questioning whether his current fencing along the east perimeter was compliant with revised setback requirements. The notice implied that portions of his fencing might encroach upon a newly proposed public right-of-way corridor, a term that had never appeared in any prior land surveys. It was a clear shot across the bow, an attempt to create leverage by threatening Ethan's existing improvements. The timing was no coincidence. Mark confirmed that the zoning inquiry was likely prompted by pressure from the Cedar Springs legal team or their developer allies. "They're throwing everything they can at you," Mark warned. trying to bleed you down or force you to settle. Ethan was not a man easily rattled, but the layered nature of the assault left him with a gnawing tension. This was not a single opponent, but a coordinated push involving private attorneys, county officials, and possibly even state-level connections. The stakes were rising fast. Determined to stay ahead, Ethan ordered a full survey of the eastern boundary, conducted by an independent firm with no ties to local developers. He also hired a public affairs consultant to begin documenting the timeline of events, a move Mark endorsed, noting that a clear record could prove invaluable later in court. At the same time, Ethan took personal steps to fortify the gate. With assistance from Jake and a trusted welder, he installed reinforced braces behind the stone columns and a secondary locking mechanism inside the gate's frame. The new system could not be seen from the road but would make forced entry exponentially more difficult. Late one night, as he stood alone by the gate, Ethan considered the road ahead. The battle was no longer theoretical. It was here, unfolding in ways that demanded constant vigilance and strategic response. The law would move slowly, but he could not afford to be passive in the meantime. And yet, despite the encroaching storm, Ethan remained resolute. His land was more than soil and timber. It was legacy, memory, and identity, all things that could not be measured in court filings or survey maps. They had chosen the wrong man to push. He would stand his ground, not with bluster, but with unwavering purpose. By the end of the first week, Ethan could feel the subtle shift in tone around the entire situation, a shift that transformed what had been a tense legal disagreement into something more insidious. The opposition had stopped merely laying the groundwork for their claim and had begun testing boundaries, both legal and physical. It wasn't just about the road anymore. It was about sending a message. They would escalate as far as necessary to force his hand. The first sign came one gray morning as Ethan made his rounds. The overnight rains had softened the ground near the east road, and as he approached the gate on foot, he noticed something strange. Fresh tire tracks, heavier than those from normal residential traffic, cut deeply into the muddy shoulder, running parallel to the road for several hundred feet. At the base of one of the stone columns supporting the gate, a portion of the earth had been disturbed. There were small flag markers, bright orange, driven into the ground in a grid pattern extending along the interior side of the fence line. Ethan knelt, brushing aside the loose soil, and found several capped metal stakes embedded into the dirt. Survey markers, newly placed. It was a deliberate provocation. No notification had been given, no permit posted. Someone had entered his property during the night or early dawn hours, not merely to stake a claim but to create a visual argument for future legal action, an effort to suggest that the boundary line of the road might extend beyond its historical footprint. When Ethan contacted Mark, his attorney wasted no time. A second emergency motion was filed, this time not only to block further work but to seek a contempt ruling for violating the cease and desist order already in place. But the wheels of justice moved slowly. The hearing wouldn't be scheduled for another 5 days. That same afternoon, Ethan received an official letter from the County Infrastructure Review Board. It informed him that an expedited application had been filed requesting reclassification of the road segment passing through his land, citing public necessity due to lack of alternate egress for the Cedar Springs community. The letter gave him 7 days to respond before a provisional review would proceed, without his consent. The noose was tightening. Determined to act before the situation spiraled further, Ethan expanded his defenses in tangible ways. He brought in a trusted security consultant, a former federal contractor named Greg Malone, to assess vulnerabilities along the east boundary. Greg spent 2 days walking the perimeter, reviewing drone footage and interviewing the ranch staff. His conclusion was stark. "You've got more exposure here than you think," he told Ethan bluntly. "They've been running recon. I spotted 3 different instances of unauthorized entry over the last week. Footprints, drone incursions, surveillance equipment. Somebody's feeding real-time intel to their legal team." With Greg's input, Ethan authorized installation of advanced perimeter monitoring, buried motion sensors, trail cameras with encrypted feeds, and an upgraded surveillance system covering the eastern approach. He also quietly contracted a specialty fabrication shop to produce materials for a fallback plan, should he need to fully fortify the ranch entrance. Meanwhile, tensions with the Cedar Springs community began to bubble into public view. Word of the legal dispute spread among residents. Some were indifferent, but others, particularly those who had purchased homes under the assumption of guaranteed road access, grew increasingly vocal. Rumors swirled that Ethan was trying to cut off the neighborhood, a narrative subtly encouraged by certain board members within the community association. Then came the second physical escalation. One morning, Jake arrived at the ranch office visibly shaken. "Boss," he said, setting down a battered metal box on the table. "You need to see this." Inside were fragments of a black plastic housing and tangled wires. Jake explained that while inspecting the fence line, he discovered a small device wedged beneath one of the fence posts near the east road. It was a wireless camera, battery-powered, with a motion sensor trigger. Greg quickly examined the device. "Commercial grade," he said. "Short-range broadcast. Somebody planted this recently, probably within the last 48 hours. They're monitoring your traffic patterns." The discovery forced Ethan to recalibrate once again. The opposition was no longer content to press claims through legal paperwork. They were actively conducting surveillance, gathering data to bolster their case or possibly to stage further provocations. Mark advised caution. "They may be baiting you," he warned. "Don't give them an excuse to accuse you of obstruction or tampering." But even caution had its limits. Later that week, a flatbed truck arrived without warning at the east gate, carrying prefabricated signage and materials for what appeared to be a kiosk structure. The work crew claimed they had authorization to install a community access information center adjacent to the road, based on an administrative filing with the county. Ethan was on site within minutes of the crew's arrival. "You're trespassing," he informed them flatly. When they refused to leave, he called the sheriff again. This time, Deputy Briggs arrived in a more serious mood. After reviewing Ethan's documentation and the crew's dubious paperwork, Briggs ordered the crew to halt installation pending a judicial review. But the message had been delivered. The opposition was escalating in both scale and brazenness. That evening, Ethan convened an emergency strategy session with Mark, Greg, and the leadership of the second law firm he'd hired. They mapped out a two-track response: intensify legal efforts to counter the reclassification attempt, and simultaneously prepare for physical fortification of the eastern boundary. The following day, Ethan took the most decisive step yet. Under cover of darkness, with Greg overseeing the operation, a team of trusted workers began staging materials for a hardened defensive barrier, a reinforced perimeter fence designed not only to mark the property line, but to physically prevent unauthorized vehicle access. It wasn't a wall, yet, but it was a clear statement. By dawn, heavy steel posts had been sunk deep along the shoulder of the road, connected by high-tension cabling and anchored with concrete footings. The installation was entirely within Ethan's property line, supported by certified survey data and legal documentation. It would be difficult, if not impossible, for opposing counsel to challenge the legality of the barrier. Predictably, the reaction from Cedar Springs was swift. Victoria Hale fired off a strongly worded demand letter accusing Ethan of unlawful obstruction and threatening immediate court action. Within hours, residents of the community began circulating petitions and posting inflammatory messages on social media platforms. Ethan, however, remained unmoved. The barrier stood. And so the first stage of the battle reached a new threshold. What had begun as a subtle legal maneuver had evolved into open confrontation, one that would now play out not only in the courts but in the physical reality of the land itself. For Ethan, there was no turning back. The escalation had been forced upon him, but he would meet it on his terms. The fight was no longer about a simple gate. It was about the fundamental right to defend what was his, and he intended to do so, relentlessly. The next turning point came not from the increasingly brazen actions of Victoria Hale and her backers, but from a deeper, quieter layer of the legal battlefield. A layer where facts, history, and truth held more weight than provocations or posturing. It began with the title research team that Ethan's second law firm had commissioned in the early days of the dispute, led by a meticulous and seasoned title investigator named Carla Pennington. The team had spent weeks combing through the labyrinth of county archives, historical property records, survey maps, and dusty legal ledgers dating back to the original land. Patents issued in the early 20th century. Carla's work was slow but methodical, her team cross-referencing physical documents with digital records and identifying subtle inconsistencies that could undermine the opposition's claims. Then, late on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, Mark received a call from Carla that changed everything. "I need to show you something in person," Carla said, her voice calm but urgent. "It's better if Mr. Cole is here too." That evening, in Mark's downtown office, Carla laid out a series of aged maps and documents on the conference table. Ethan leaned over them, studying the yellowed pages with growing interest as Carla began her explanation. "This," she said, pointing to a plat map dated 1946, "is the original survey for this section of the county. As you can see, the Cole Ranch Road, what's now at issue, was recorded here as a private agricultural access road, with no public dedication or implied easement. That's consistent with every subsequent map until 2004. She then laid out a second document. "But here," she continued, "is where things get interesting. In 2005, during a digital conversion of county records, a revised map was uploaded. It contains a subtle but critical change. The road segment in question was reclassified as potential public corridor pending review. The problem is, there's no legal record of any such review, approval, or public dedication ever taking place." Mark's brow furrowed. "You're saying this was inserted without proper authorization?" Carla nodded. "Exactly. It appears to have been an administrative error, or perhaps a deliberate insertion by someone with access to the digital conversion process." Ethan exhaled slowly, processing the significance of what he was hearing. So their entire argument about historical public use could be built on a ghost record. "Precisely," Carla confirmed, "and we can prove it." The legal implications were massive. If Ethan's team could demonstrate that the foundation of the Cedar Springs claim was rooted in a flawed or falsified record, the entire effort to establish a prescriptive or implied easement could collapse. Mark moved quickly. Within 24 hours, the law firms prepared a comprehensive evidentiary package, including sworn affidavits from retired county clerks and historical surveyors who attested to the original status of the road. They also secured a forensic analysis of the digital records to show that the 2005 revision lacked proper metadata and authorization trails. Armed with this new evidence, Mark filed an emergency motion to suspend the county's reclassification review and to request a full evidentiary hearing on the legitimacy of the Cedar Springs claim. Meanwhile, Ethan continued to fortify his position on the ground. With Greg's guidance, additional layers of physical and electronic security were added to the eastern perimeter. Drones equipped with thermal imaging were deployed to monitor after-hours activity. The new surveillance footage soon revealed what they had suspected: multiple nighttime incursions by unidentified individuals attempting to document or potentially sabotage the newly installed barrier. Each incident was logged and reported to law enforcement, though Ethan knew the sheriff's office remained politically cautious given the high-profile nature of the dispute. Still, every report added to the growing body of evidence that Ethan and his team were building, not only to defend against the current threat but to preempt future claims of misconduct. Then came the inevitable counterstrike. Victoria Hale's legal team filed a lawsuit accusing Ethan of willful obstruction of established community access. and seeking an emergency injunction to dismantle the barrier. The suit was accompanied by a carefully orchestrated media campaign within Cedar Springs, designed to paint Ethan as an unreasonable landowner jeopardizing the welfare of local families. The rhetoric was sharp and emotional. Residents posted angry messages on local forums and social media, claiming that emergency services were being blocked and that children were being endangered by Ethan's actions. It was a narrative designed to sway public sentiment and to pressure local officials into acting against Ethan. But Ethan was prepared. At the injunction hearing, Mark and the co-counsel presented their evidence with surgical precision. They dismantled the opposition's arguments point by point, demonstrating that no lawful public easement had ever been granted or recorded. The road remained private property by every legal standard. The newly discovered flaws in the county's records invalidated the foundation of the Cedar Springs claim. The alternative access route provided by Ethan through a neighboring property, arranged weeks earlier, met all requirements for emergency egress, nullifying the opposition's claims of public endangerment. The judge, a no-nonsense veteran of property law cases, listened carefully and ultimately ruled in Ethan's favor, denying the request for emergency injunction and granting a temporary restraining order against further unauthorized incursions onto Ethan's land. It was a pivotal victory. For the first time, the tide of the battle had shifted visibly in Ethan's favor. The opposition's carefully constructed narrative had been publicly dismantled, their legal footing visibly weakened. Yet Ethan knew the fight was far from over. The Cedar Springs Board, the developers behind them, and their legal team were not likely to retreat after a single courtroom setback. If anything, they would regroup and escalate again. But for now, Ethan had secured critical breathing room, and more importantly, he had exposed the core weakness in the opposition's case. The middle ground of the battle had been reached, and from here, every move would matter even more. And through it all, Ethan remained resolute. The land was his. The law was on his side, and he would defend both with unwavering resolve, no matter how long the battle took. The calm that followed the initial courtroom victory was brief, almost illusory. Ethan knew better than to interpret the judge's ruling as the end of the conflict. It was merely a pause, a tactical adjustment period for the opposition. And indeed, they wasted no time. Within a week of the hearing, subtle signs of renewed activity began to appear. There were fresh footprints near the eastern perimeter, new tire tracks on side trails where no authorized vehicles should have been. Surveillance footage captured several late-night visits from unknown individuals, carefully timed and executed just beyond the legal boundaries of trespass but designed to test Ethan's response and to probe for vulnerabilities. Meanwhile, the Cedar Springs Board shifted its strategy from direct legal confrontation to political and bureaucratic pressure. One morning, a certified letter arrived from the county tax assessor's office informing Ethan of an unscheduled review of the ranch's agricultural tax status. The letter cited recent structural changes and modifications observed along the eastern boundary as the reason for the review. The implication was clear. If the county chose to reclassify portions of the land as non-agricultural, Ethan would face a significant increase in property taxes, an economic pressure tactic aimed at forcing compromise. Mark immediately filed a protest with the assessor's office, citing the baseless nature of the review and attaching legal documentation proving that the new boundary installations were fully compliant with zoning regulations and posed no change to land use. But the pressure didn't stop there. Within days, Ethan's water supplier, a private cooperative, suddenly reported infrastructure issues affecting deliveries to the eastern pasture irrigation system. Scheduled maintenance was delayed without explanation, and service interruptions followed. Greg's investigation quickly revealed that certain members of the cooperative board had close ties to the same developer interests behind the Cedar Springs expansion. It was another lever, another attempt to squeeze Ethan economically and operationally. Recognizing the pattern, Ethan broadened his defenses once more. He hired an independent water engineering firm to design a backup irrigation system fed by deep wells within the core ranch property, costly but necessary insurance against further interference. Simultaneously, he engaged a seasoned political consultant with experience navigating county-level disputes. The consultant's first piece of advice was blunt but insightful. "You're in a proxy war now. The courtroom is just one front. The real fight is for narrative and influence. You need allies." Ethan took the advice to heart. Quietly but deliberately, he began building bridges with neighboring landowners, local business owners, and influential figures in the ranching and agricultural community. Many sympathized with his plight. Several had faced similar pressures from developers and county officials eager to carve up private land for public or commercial use. Over dinners, coffee meetings, and quiet conversations, Ethan wove a network of support grounded in shared principles: respect for property rights, skepticism of overreach, and a fierce commitment to preserving the rural character of their community. At the same time, tensions within Cedar Springs itself were beginning to fracture the opposition's unity. Word of the flawed county records and the judge's initial ruling had spread among residents. Many now questioned the competence and honesty of Victoria Hale and the board. Some feared legal exposure or financial liability if the association's aggressive actions were found to have violated Ethan's rights. A small but growing faction of residents began calling for a more conciliatory approach, privately urging Victoria to negotiate a formal access agreement rather than continuing a costly and divisive battle. But Victoria was not one to yield easily. In response to the internal dissent, she doubled down on external pressure. A new round of legal filings was prepared, this time alleging that Ethan's enhanced security measures constituted an unreasonable nuisance, and seeking injunctive relief to force their removal. The filings were accompanied by a wave of orchestrated public relations efforts, letters to the editor in local papers, op-eds penned by sympathetic figures, and coordinated social media campaigns portraying Ethan as an extremist landowner, threatening the welfare of innocent families. Ethan, however, remained undeterred. Guided by his legal team and political consultant, he responded with equal precision. Publicly, he maintained a calm and factual tone, issuing carefully worded statements emphasizing his commitment to lawful property rights, public safety, and reasonable accommodation through proper legal channels. Privately, he continued to gather evidence of misconduct: surveillance footage of unauthorized surveillance attempts, records of coordinated PR activity linked to developer-funded entities, and detailed documentation of every attempt to interfere with ranch operations. Then came the next major escalation, one that crossed a dangerous new threshold. Late one night, just past midnight, the ranch's perimeter alarms were triggered near the southeast corner of the eastern boundary. Greg and two ranch hands responded immediately, armed with high-powered spotlights and non-lethal defense equipment. What they found sent a chill through the team. Several sections of the newly installed barrier had been deliberately damaged, steel cables cut with industrial equipment, anchor points tampered with. More disturbing was the discovery of multiple trail cams and motion sensors that had been stolen or destroyed. The sabotage was calculated, professional, and unmistakably intended as a warning. Law enforcement was notified immediately, and a formal criminal investigation was opened. However, Ethan harbored no illusions about the likely outcome. Political pressures and jurisdictional sensitivities would make any swift enforcement unlikely. In response, he activated the fallback plan that had been quietly prepared over the past weeks. Under cover of night, with trusted crews and under Greg's direct supervision, a more formidable defensive structure was erected, a high-tension cable and gabion wall system designed to be both visually imposing and physically impenetrable to unauthorized vehicles. Every installation was meticulously documented, surveyed, and legally certified to withstand future challenges. Simultaneously, Mark filed new motions seeking judicial sanctions against the Cedar Springs Board for their role in escalating the conflict and violating prior court orders. The motions were supported by the newly gathered evidence of sabotage and coordinated harassment. As the situation reached this new crescendo, the political consultant urged Ethan to take one more critical step. Transparency. You need to pull the curtain back, he advised. Expose their tactics to the wider community, not just in the courtroom, but in the court of public opinion. Ethan agreed. With the help of a respected local journalist known for integrity and impartiality, a detailed investigative report was prepared, documenting the entire timeline of the dispute, the flawed county records, the aggressive legal tactics, the sabotage, incidents, and the broader implications for property rights. The report was published in a prominent regional outlet, sparking widespread discussion and debate. The impact was immediate. Public sentiment began to shift. Influential community leaders and local elected officials, previously cautious or neutral, began speaking out in support of Ethan's position. The growing political cost of continued escalation became harder for the Cedar Springs Board and their developer allies to ignore. Yet, even amid this shifting landscape, Ethan remained vigilant. He knew that wounded adversaries often acted out of desperation. Every day brought new risks and potential provocations. But fortified by legal victories, community support, and an unshakable resolve, he stood ready. The second escalation had tested every facet of his endurance, strategy, and will. But through it all, Ethan had refused to bend. The fight was far from over, but now, for the first time, the momentum was his to command. By late summer, the conflict over Ethan's ranch road had reached a boiling point. The failed injunction attempts, the public backlash triggered by the investigative report, and the mounting legal pressure had begun to fracture the once solid alliance between Victoria Hale, the Cedar Springs Board, and their developer backers. But fractured did not mean defeated. In fact, desperation was now driving their actions in unpredictable and dangerous directions. Ethan remained acutely aware of this reality, which is why he maintained a relentless focus on both legal precision and operational readiness. The gabion wall and cable barrier at the eastern perimeter now stood as an immovable line, a literal and symbolic declaration that further encroachments would not be tolerated. The legal motions filed by Mark and the co-counsel firm had not only withstood the latest challenges, but had also resulted in a scheduled evidentiary hearing that would determine the future of the Cedar Springs claim once and for all. The days leading up to the hearing were tense. Surveillance activity around the ranch intensified again. Drones flew low over the property during twilight hours, clearly attempting to document potential public safety hazards for use in court. Greg's team logged every incursion and began counter-surveillance efforts designed to both protect the ranch and gather further evidence of harassment. Meanwhile, Mark worked tirelessly with Carla Pennington and the title research team to finalize an airtight presentation for the hearing. Their case now included sworn affidavits from former county surveyors, forensic analysis of digital record tampering, and a comprehensive history of land use proving that the road had never held any lawful public easement designation. The opposition's case, by contrast, had begun to unravel. Internal communications leaked by a disillusioned Cedar Springs board member revealed that Victoria and her legal team had knowingly pursued their claims despite clear evidence of the flawed 2005 map entry. These documents, carefully vetted by Ethan's attorneys, were added to the evidentiary record, exposing not just the legal weakness of the opposition's argument, but also the bad faith driving their campaign. But just as momentum appeared firmly in Ethan's favor, a final act of sabotage jolted the situation into crisis. 2 nights before the scheduled hearing, the ranch's surveillance system recorded 3 masked individuals attempting to breach the western perimeter, a location previously untouched by the conflict. The intruders were intercepted by Greg's team before they could cause significant damage, but their equipment, a portable cutting torch and communication devices, suggested a level of coordination beyond random vandalism. Law enforcement was again notified, and this time the political climate had shifted enough that the sheriff's office launched a full investigation. The timing of the breach was no coincidence. The clear intent was to distract, intimidate, or provoke Ethan into an overreaction that could be used against him in court. But Ethan had anticipated such a move. He instructed everyone on the ranch to maintain discipline and to let the legal process continue unimpeded. On the morning of the hearing, Ethan walked into the county courthouse with Mark, Carla, Greg, and a small cadre of legal allies. The courtroom was packed, not just with attorneys and court staff, but with members of the public, local journalists, and a sizable contingent of Cedar Springs residents, many of whom had grown disillusioned with their own leadership. The atmosphere was electric with tension. The judge, a stern and highly respected jurist named Margaret Rollins, wasted no time setting the tone. She made it clear that the day's proceedings would be governed by facts, not emotional appeals or political theatrics. The Cedar Springs legal team opened with a predictably dramatic argument, attempting to paint Ethan as an obstructionist whose actions endangered public welfare. They cited emergency vehicle access concerns, presented carefully edited drone footage, and leaned heavily on the long-standing community use narrative. But when Mark rose to speak, the dynamic in the room shifted palpably. With calm authority, he dismantled the opposition's claims point by point. He presented the forensic evidence of digital tampering, the historical surveys, the affidavits, and the internal communications showing that Victoria's team had proceeded in bad faith. Carla's testimony was particularly devastating. Her expert analysis of the flawed 2005 entry left no room for doubt that the supposed public corridor designation had no lawful basis. When Greg took the stand to present evidence of the surveillance and sabotage campaign, including the most recent attempted breach, the judge's demeanor hardened further. The pattern of harassment, coupled with the legally baseless nature of the Cedar Springs claim, painted a damning picture of the opposition's tactics. Victoria, visibly strained, attempted a late-stage pivot, proposing that the court mandate a mediated settlement to restore community harmony. But it was too late. The damage had been done, and the judge was not inclined to reward bad behavior with a compromise. In her ruling, delivered with unmistakable finality, Judge Rollins granted full injunctive relief in Ethan's favor. She affirmed the private status of the ranch road, invalidated the Cedar Springs claims, and ordered the immediate cessation of all unauthorized activity related to the disputed access route. Furthermore, she referred evidence of potential legal misconduct by certain Cedar Springs board members and their legal counsel to the state bar and relevant prosecutorial authorities. The courtroom erupted, not in cheers, but in a collective exhale. For Ethan, the ruling was more than a legal victory. It was a vindication of principle, a defense of legacy, and a clear signal that integrity still mattered in the face of calculated aggression. Yet, even in victory, Ethan remained clear-eyed. The opposition might be legally defeated, but political and social ripples would persist. Some Cedar Springs residents would continue to harbor resentment, while others might seek genuine reconciliation. Ethan resolved to meet the post-conflict phase with the same resolve and dignity he had shown throughout the battle. The land was secure, the law had spoken, but the work of healing and protecting his legacy would continue. As he left the courthouse that day, Ethan paused beneath the wide sky, the sun breaking through scattered clouds. The road ahead remained long, but it was his to walk, and on his own terms. In the weeks that followed the courtroom victory, the landscape of both the legal battle and the surrounding community began to shift in subtle but unmistakable ways. The Cedar Springs Board, reeling from the judge's ruling and the growing unrest among its own residents, saw several of its most vocal members, including Victoria Hale herself, step down under increasing scrutiny. The state bar's investigation into the misconduct allegations proceeded quietly in the background, a cloud that would linger over certain parties for months, if not years. For Ethan, the immediate concern was not retribution or triumphalism, but stability. The Gabion wall and reinforced barrier remained in place, serving both as a legal marker of the ranch boundary and as a practical deterrent against further encroachments. Yet he understood that a hardened perimeter alone could not resolve the deeper tensions that had been inflamed during the conflict. There were still residents within Cedar Springs, ordinary families, many of whom had been misled or caught in the crossfire, who needed clarity about what the future would hold. Rather than retreat into isolation, Ethan took a deliberate step toward engagement. With advice from both Mark and his political consultant, he drafted a formal letter to the Cedar Springs homeowners, which was distributed through neutral channels. In it, he outlined the court's findings, reiterated his respect for lawful property rights, and extended an offer to negotiate a carefully structured private access agreement, one that would respect his ownership while providing limited, controlled access under strict legal terms and with proper indemnification clauses to protect against future liabilities. The response was more positive than he had anticipated. Freed from the board's prior hardline narrative, many residents welcomed the opportunity for a formalized, stable solution. A new interim board, more pragmatic and less influenced by developer interests, quickly opened a dialogue. Over several weeks of negotiations, conducted through attorneys and mediated by neutral facilitators, a mutually acceptable agreement was reached. Under its terms, Cedar Springs would gain a limited easement for specific residential traffic, governed by strict usage protocols, gated access controlled by Ethan's system, and with clear maintenance and liability responsibilities assigned to the community. In return, the residents would formally acknowledge the private status of the underlying land and forego any future claims to broaden or alter the easement's scope. The agreement was legally recorded, providing a durable framework to prevent future disputes. Simultaneously, Ethan moved to secure his position even further. He commissioned an updated title insurance policy that reflected the court's ruling and the terms of the new agreement. He also initiated a broader legal review of adjacent parcels to identify and preempt any similar risks. The process was exhaustive, but necessary. Experience had taught him that vigilance could not be relaxed, not even in victory. Within the community, the mood gradually stabilized. The most divisive voices faded, while new leadership emphasized cooperation and respect for lawful boundaries. The rhetoric of conflict gave way to quieter, more productive conversations. Ethan himself remained cautious but open to continued dialogue. In time, he even hosted a small gathering at the ranch, inviting select members of the new Cedar Springs board and neighboring landowners to share a meal and, perhaps, to begin building the kind of trust that legal documents alone could never fully guarantee. Yet beneath the surface, Ethan remained the same vigilant guardian of his family's land. He knew that development pressures would not vanish, nor would the appetite of certain interests to leverage legal gray areas for gain. But he also knew that he had faced the storm and prevailed, not through bluster or rash action, but through deliberate, principled resolve. As autumn settled over the rolling fields, casting long golden shadows across the land, Ethan would often ride the eastern boundary at dusk. The road remained quiet now, the traffic controlled and respectful. The barrier stood firm, both as a symbol of the battle won and as a reminder of what it had taken to secure it. The land had always been more than property. It was heritage, responsibility, and identity. And through the crucible of conflict, Ethan had reaffirmed his role as its steward, not merely by defending it, but by guiding it into a future shaped by law, integrity, and hard-earned wisdom.